Oklahoma is the land of second, third, and last chances. Who were the people that made it so? We'll trace the golden threads they've woven through Oklahoma history. The Red River Institute, JohnJDwyer.com, and our signature sponsor, Atwoods, present Oklahoma Gold. While John J. Dwyer is completing the Oklahomans Volume 2, he is sharing his microphone with Red River Institute board member and award-winning author, broadcaster, and avocational historian Wade Burleson. I'm Gwen Falconer-Lippert. We'll dig for the golden nuggets of Oklahoma history here now on Oklahoma Gold, the Burleson Chapters. Dignifying our history through the stories we share. Wade Burleson, Thomas Jefferson, and the Great Salt Speech?
Yeah.
What is this story?
Yeah, Gwen, let me ask you, have you ever been to the Great Salt Plains of northwest Oklahoma? You've been there.
It's amazing.
It is. It's like everywhere you look, it's salt that's on the ground. It's called the Great Salt Plains. If you're living in Oklahoma or nearby and you've never been there, it's worth a day trip. There are some crystals that you can dig for. The only place in the world you can find them is in the Great Salt Plains. But let me tell you how Thomas Jefferson, President of the United States, and the Great Salt Plains are tied together. Most everyone has heard of the Lewis and Clark expedition. Mm-hmm. In fact, Oklahoma, the land of Oklahoma, was obtained from France through a treaty with Napoleon. And when we bought it, I mean, it was pennies on the acre. But there were a lot of people upset that Jefferson bought the Louisiana Purchase, is what it's called, because they called it a vast desert. Nobody knew what was there. I mean, it's hard for Americans today to imagine that in the early 1800s, nobody knows what is west of the Mississippi. It's just a vast desert. St. Louis was the gateway to the west. Beyond St. Louis, nobody knew what was there. So, I mean, people really got angry with Jefferson for purchasing the Louisiana Territory, which, of course, all of Oklahoma is encompassed in that.
What was the date of that?
1803. In fact, April the 30th, to be specific, 1803, the United States purchased from France Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte Louisiana Territory for $15 million. It's 828,000 square acres, and again, it comes to 4 cents an acre. But Jefferson was still criticized for buying it. So, like any good politician, he decides he's going to make the case for the purchase of the Louisiana Territory. And he calls for Congress to assemble a combined legislative assembly, meaning both the House and the Senate, in November of 1803. And he wants to justify the purchase of the Louisiana Purchase, and he does so in what is called the Great Salt Speech, November 1803. And I want to quote from that speech. He says this: "One extraordinary fact relative to salt in the Louisiana Territory must not be omitted. There exists within the territory, no one knows where, a great mountain of salt. It is said to be miles long, 45 miles in width, composed of solid rock salt without any trees." Now, that was the justification for Congress giving the millions of dollars for the purchase of the territory.
The world's largest mountain of salt.
Correct. Now, what most folks don't understand about salt is this. Back then, salt was like gold. In fact, it's called white gold. You've ever heard the phrase, "that man is not worth his salt"? Well, we get the word salt in English from the Latin word salus, from which we get our word salary. Because back in the day, people were paid their salary with salt. Yeah, that's where we say a man's not worth his salt. Salt was valuable. You had to have salt to preserve meat. You had no refrigeration. You had to have salt to live. And so salt was hard to come by. But if salt was just lying on the ground to pick up, like a mountain of salt, it would be like finding gold on the ground to pick up. It would be worth, today, billions millions of dollars. So Jefferson was saying, let's fund Lewis and Clark to find this mountain of salt. Now, how did America even know about the mountain of salt?
How did they?
Well, you had French Indian traders. You had trappers. You had people hunting in the mountains of Colorado who would traverse the Great Plains, and word would come from the Native Americans of this vast area of salt. And by the way, they would know of it because the Native Americans would camp around it during winter because it was a natural salt lick for animals. And animals, just like human beings, have to have salt. So, I mean, this great mountain of salt was rumored among all the Native Americans, and the French traders picked up on this rumor, and it got back to Jefferson, and so he justified the purchase of the Louisiana Territory for this mountain of salt. Now, I propose to you, I know people have heard of the Great Salt Plains in Utah and Salt Lake City and so on, but that was a little too far west. I am of the opinion that the mountain of salt being referred to by the French traders was the Great Salt Plains of northwest Oklahoma. And when Jefferson sent Lewis and Clark to explore the West, he pulled them aside, and this is seen in all of the historical documents, and he presses upon them, please do everything within your power to find this mountain of salt. It would justify the millions of dollars spent for the Louisiana Territory. So when Lewis and Clark set out from St. Louis on the Lewis and Clark expedition, in the forefront of their mind, they wanted to find this massive area of natural salt. It would make the United States a fortune, however. When they came back, Gwen, from their expedition 2.5 years later, they had not found it. And Jefferson was criticized in the press because it wasn't found.
So why would you think it's northwest Oklahoma and not Utah?
Well, that's a great question. What happened was after Jefferson, his term as president ended, his 2 terms, this Salt Mountain was still on his heart and on his mind. He wanted to find it. And so he began to write letters to the troops who were stationed out west, including to a young man by the name of Major George C. Sibley. His father was a very close friend of Jefferson, and Major Sibley was stationed at a post in Missouri, and he received a request from Jefferson to go find the Salt Mountain that Lewis and Clark could not find. But when we come back in a moment, I will tell you how Jefferson, until his dying day, searched for this mountain of salt, and the son of his best friend ended up finding it in northwest Oklahoma. We'll talk about it when we come back.
So the salt, you think, is in Oklahoma and not in Utah?
That's right.
Stitching the past to the present. This is Oklahoma Gold. Thomas Jefferson and the Great Salt Speech. Quite a name, Wade Burleson.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it is. Remember, Jefferson wanted to find this mountain of salt, and when Lewis and Clark did not find it, his 8 years of presidency were over. Until he died, Jefferson continued to look for it. And as I said earlier, he wrote letters to troops that were on the frontier. And eventually, Major George C. Sibley, stationed in Missouri at a frontier post, received a letter from his father asking on behalf of the former president, Thomas Jefferson, to find this mountain of salt. Now, let me tell you a little bit about Major George C. Sibley. He was a Christian man who loved logic and possessed a rational faith. He grew up in the home of his maternal grandfather, the famous Puritan Congregational minister Samuel Hopkins. Now, those of you listening may not know who Samuel Hopkins is, but let me just tell you that his great-uncle, Sibley's great-uncle, was Jonathan Edwards, the great Puritan theologian of America. Sibley was a Christian man who believed that God would help him. So in his diary, he records that because the former president wanted to find this salt mountain, he believed God had given him that mission. He got on his knees and asked for God's help to find it. So on May the 11th, 1811, Major Sibley sets out from Fort Osage with one of his goals being the discovery of the rumored mountain of salt. And he travels with two other white men who act as interpreters and several Osage Indians who serve as his guides. And Sibley led his party of interpreters and Osage Indians to a Kansas village, that's an Indian village, on the Kansas River near present-day Manhattan, Kansas. And the group proceeded further north and met with some Pawnee Indians on the Platte River, and then Sibley's expedition began to journey south at a rapid pace, finally stopping at some Osage Indian village near what we call the Arkansas River in northern Oklahoma. And it was on this brief trip through northwest Oklahoma in June of 1811 that Major George Champlain Sibley discovered what the Indians and French traders had long spoken of and what had become known as Jefferson's Mountain of Salt along the Salt Fork River, a tributary of the Arkansas River in northwest Oklahoma. Major Sibley came across 11,000 acres of land that gleamed in midday with shimmering white brilliance. He called it the Grand Saline. It later came to be called the Great Salt Plains. And if you live in Oklahoma or have been in Oklahoma and have never seen this extraordinary salt plains, you are missing a beautiful masterpiece of creation. The land looks like a brilliant field of snow. And what you've got to understand is that when Major Sibley found it, it was as if he struck gold. Thomas Jefferson's Mountain of Salt had been found. And if you go to the Great Salt Plains in northwest Oklahoma today, and you walk the walking trails or you ride a horse, everywhere you will go, you will see signs that tell you about Major Sibley's discovery in June of 1811. Now, what's particularly fascinating about the Great Salt Plains in northwest Oklahoma is this. Daniel Boone's son found out about Major Sibley's discovery, and he came to northwest Oklahoma, back then it was called Indian Territory, to establish a salt works in order to produce, to gather, and sell the salt. The problem is that Great Salt Plains in northwest Oklahoma was a natural salt lick for the game of northwest Oklahoma, and all of the Plainsmen Indians would come and hunt the Great Salt Plains during the winter. And so you took your life into your own hands, as did Daniel Boone's son, Nathan Boone, when he tried a salt works. He ended up giving up on it. And then what also happened was, eventually, a production of salt became a whole lot easier in the mid to late 1800s, and salt began to lose its value. But the discovery of the salt plains of northwest Oklahoma is tied to the Great Salt Speech of Thomas Jefferson in November 1803.
And because salt was as valuable as gold, Wade Burleson, what's the golden nugget?
Well, here's what I would say about the golden nugget of Oklahoma's history and the Great Salt Plains. There was a young lady by the name of Cynthia Ann Parker. She was a 9-year-old daughter of a Baptist preacher in Texas who was kidnapped by Comanche Indians in May of 1836. And when she was kidnapped, for the next 25 years, she lived among the Comanches. And in her diary, she talks about living in the Great Salt Plains of northwest Oklahoma during the winters among the Comanches. And of course, it is this Caucasian Baptist preacher's daughter's son, Quanah Parker, who becomes the last Indian chief of the Comanche tribe. All of this from the Great Salt Plains of Oklahoma.
Now that's I want to say Oklahoma salt, but I will say Oklahoma gold.